Welcome to Break the Box, a podcast at the intersection of faith, entrepreneurship, and creativity. I'm your host, Jake Starkey. The goal of this podcast is to tell the story of other Christian entrepreneurs and creatives and encourage you to break out of whatever box is holding you back. If you're a first-time listener, I encourage you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, Season 2 is coming soon, and we're excited to bring more of these to you on a regular basis. On this episode of Break the Box, we talk with Meredith King from To Life Ministries about starting a nonprofit during the recession, God's calling on her life, and how she balances motherhood and entrepreneurship. Here's my conversation with Meredith King. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and even better that we're sitting down having this conversation.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to finally make it work out. We've been trying for a while. So
hey, perseverance wins the day.
That's right. So let's start at the beginning. True to Life has been around for 7 years now?
Almost 8. Oh. It's hard to believe.
But before that, you were highly involved in church, and you were mentioning just now that you did a Bible study for years. And then you moved off for college?
Yes.
One, what made you want to come back to your hometown-esque? And two, what propelled you to want to start a nonprofit like you did?
Okay, so those are two really big questions there, Jake. So related to moving back, I moved to College Station to go to Texas A&M. I'm an Aggie. And after graduation, I stayed because I was working for a nonprofit organization there. That transitioned into a corporate dream job that I loved and was incredibly passionate about. Over the course of kind of that time frame, David and I got married. We lived in College Station for a few years after we got married, and it was really David that caused us to move back. So we're both from here. He was really feeling like his next assignment was to help with a church down here in this area. And so we moved. We moved so that he could say yes to that opportunity. And I kept my corporate job, though, and I just worked from here. So I traveled from here. I did, all of my work from home, and that worked out great for a little season. In the process of that, Hurricane Ike happened down here, which was a catalyst really for me to reconnect with some passions that never left my heart. And I'm a preacher's kid. Don't hold that against me. I had the opportunity to grow up in a household where not only was I a preacher's kid, but my family, my parents, lived an incredible example of what it looked like to make disciples and to invite people in to our family and to our home. So my father did a lot of inner city work. I'm an only child. I got to go with him a ton, and that really shaped a lot of my heart's passions. He was working with gang members and addicts and women who were engaged in prostitution, and that certainly shaped my view of what it looked like to reach out and to point people to Jesus. And so when Hurricane Ike happened, just by the fact that we were in the area, I started volunteering with some of the relief efforts, led to a relationship with a group of about 5 women who didn't know each other before, but they kept ending up in my line, regardless of what resource I was helping with, whether it was food or water or FEMA assistance. These women kept ending up in my line. They very much believed that they'd done too much, gone too far, that God couldn't love them. And because they were in line together so much, they formed a friendship, and that led to us meeting together once a week in an apartment here in our area to talk about the gospel. And we did that together for a year while they were facing major challenges. One was expecting her 4th child. The father of the children had just gone to prison. One had been engaged in prostitution since her teenage years, but she didn't want to be anymore. One was a recovering addict. I mean, the stories were serious and real time. And so we were just kind of sharing this journey together. And as we would try to overcome obstacles that they were facing, it just became apparent that some of the support that they needed for the long haul because they were making major life change didn't really exist here. Our local churches weren't equipped to be able to provide it. The other nonprofits in the community at the time really focused on crisis intervention, and they needed a long-term support system to help them overcome those obstacles. So long story short, that's when God really made it clear that we needed to start True to Life.
And so how did that conversation go with your husband where you had a job?
Yes.
And he said, hey, honey, I really think I should start this nonprofit. Mm-hmm. How did that go?
Well, so David and I met as high school students. We done a lot of life together. And back then, way back then, we talked about starting an organization like True to Life someday. I think God dropped that vision and desire in our hearts a long time ago. I assumed that it would be a hobby once we retired. It would be much later in life. I don't think David felt that way. I think he knew that it would be sooner. So, when God, it's so easy to read the Gospels and to think that, just all of a sudden Jesus said, come follow me. And then, the disciples left everything they had and went to follow Jesus. But if you really look at the stories across the Gospels, there was interaction over time. And that's how it was for me. So it was a building process of seeing the need, experiencing the need, God reminding me in very specific ways of some of my childhood experiences with my father, of those conversations David and I had in high school. And I started getting really miserable because I knew that change was coming and that God was about to turn our lives upside down. And David is very calm and confident and truly has a gift of faith. I think God can give all of us faith, but some people really seem to have an extra amount. And my husband is one of those people. So it was a no-brainer to him. So the conversation kind of went like this. We were making a long drive back from north of Houston. We'd gone to a birthday party up there. And this was one of many conversations that we'd had about this tension that we were feeling and what we were seeing in our community. And I was spending every free moment I had working with women and young men in our community who were struggling. So it was becoming pretty obvious. And David just looked at me and said, Meredith, how long are you going to let fear keep you from doing what you know God is asking us to do? So that was like the mic drop kind of moment.
That is awesome.
So there was no talking him into it. He knew all along. It was me that had to be convinced.
That's great. Yeah, and in knowing David, he is a very even-keeled person. I can just... Mm-hmm. That would have been a funny conversation to see. Because I could see you really working over it and wanting to see how it goes, and then he's just sitting there kind of shrugging, going, yeah, come on, let's go.
Yeah, and it... I tend to really overthink things, and it didn't make logical sense at all because, he was working in a very small church, making very small church pastor pay, and I had this great job that was perfectly secure. And this was 2009 when the economy was completely in the tank. So starting a nonprofit organization just didn't seem like a great idea at the time. But, when God is being so clear, there's a peace that comes with that. So we went for it.
Sure. And how did you, I like what you said about there's a lot of nonprofits that are crisis intervention. Mm-hmm. How did you kind of decide, you started going through and you mentioned the crisis intervention versus what True to Life does of long-term care. Mm-hmm. Was it really based on those 5 women who you got to spend that time with? Or how did you shape beyond the fact of, I want to have a nonprofit and I want to help people? Mm-hmm. How did you shape it into what True to Life has become? Yeah.
So I think it's a lifetime of experience working with my parents. My father led a ministry that worked with recovering addicts over a long period of time. But even so, seeing their struggles of what it was like to find freedom from addiction, but then to re-enter normal life. my dad, as part of that ministry, ran a food pantry. So I'd seen up close the value of crisis intervention services. I spent a lot of time working in other inner city settings and with at-risk populations. So whether that was in Bryan, Texas, or in Washington, D.C., I had some years, both in my childhood and as an adult, working with people as they were trying to climb out of that pit of poverty. And so my perspective is very much that it takes a village. People need a variety of resources, both in a community and just in their life, in order to make that transition. Crisis intervention is one of those resources. There's a real need for food when someone is hungry, or for emergency shelter when they don't have a home. But when I looked at what was available in our community, those things were available. There were food pantries. There is an outstanding crisis pregnancy center for people who are experiencing crisis pregnancies. There was a homeless shelter. Wasn't very big, but it existed,
Right, yeah.
So all of those crisis intervention services were there, but what was missing the gap was, that long-term process of walking with people in this journey, and the preventative side, of working with students to equip them with the resources they need so that they don't continue in those same cycles.
Sure. And so your job as executive director, you kind of have now, I'm sure you were everything at one point.
That is so true. Just like any other entrepreneur who starts a business, you are everything in the beginning. You are HR, marketing, product and program developer. You're the fundraiser, the website person.
Well, it seems to me, too, that for what you're doing, there's really two hats you have to wear. One of being the fundraiser, going and talking to people, and then also the implementation person of actually helping these people get out of poverty, helping them go through this process for the long-term care. How difficult was it for you to kind of switch those two hats? Because it does seem to me to be two separate things to have to wrap your head fully around.
Well, I think it's interesting. So the corporate job that I had before we started True to Life was primarily consulting and sales. Okay, so I worked with nonprofit organizations, churches, and even some for-profit organizations to help them with organizational challenges that they were facing, strategic planning, and things like that. But I also, was in a little bit of a sales role. So I went from helping organizations and churches and businesses, helping them get unstuck, to helping people get unstuck on an individual basis. So it's funny, but it's very similar as far as the approach is concerned.
Really?
And I've always really enjoyed pulling people together. I love pulling people together and helping them see how they can be part of a bigger picture. And so fundraising was never one of my top goals, but I knew that this job was way bigger than David and I could ever do on our own. And so we needed our community to rally and to be involved because the need was massive. So it was easy to invite people to be a part of that. And, I think God in his sovereignty, just every life experience that we have kind of prepares for the next season. And he gave me some experiences that could help lay the foundation for the work of True to Life. But then I also was very aware of when I was out of my league, and so I got a lot of help. I have great mentors in my life. I reached out to experts who knew more than I did, and I still do that because I think it's so important. But as hard as it was in the early days when I had to wear all of the hats, switching between, direct service to clients and fundraising, strangely wasn't very hard for me. That's not everyone's experience.
Yeah.
But.
And so as an entrepreneur, you start out, you're the sole person doing everything and wearing all the hats. As True to Life started to grow, how did you come to terms with that growth, and how did you decide where to grow? For instance, you eventually hire someone. Mm-hmm. How did you decide whether that was fundraising side or the client services side? How did that conversation go for you?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with playing to our strengths. I'm a huge fan of overcoming our personal constraints because that's needed in leadership growth. But at the end of the day, there are some things that we are more inclined to be successful in than others. So I just started looking at the things that I could do but wasn't great at, and knowing that somebody else would do a better job with those things. And that's kind of how we built our hiring strategy. And I'm a huge fan of building a team of experts. I might have a little knowledge about something, and that might have been okay day one.
Sure,
but I'm very interested at putting people in seats where they are leveraging expertise, know more about their area than I do, so that we can really gain some ground and moving forward.
Sure. So the True to Life is growing. Mm-hmm. It's 8 years old, partnered with a bunch of great organizations. I look on the wall outside and I see this long list of people that support you. Mm-hmm. I enjoy getting things started and sometimes have a hard time with the maintenance part of it. How do you stay engaged and excited about something like what you're doing?
Yeah, I think as an entrepreneur, your role changes every year. So I feel like my job description has changed almost every year because the growth has been so rapid. So that certainly helped to keep things interesting. But Jake, I'm going to tell you the truth. There were a few years kind of in the middle where I really didn't enjoy what I was doing. It was really hard. I was doing things that were very much outside of my comfort zone, that didn't play to my strengths, and it was really hard. But I knew that season was necessary in order to accomplish the vision. But I think, having a team and not being on your own is so helpful, whether that's a team of volunteers or people who are earning a paycheck. Not being in it alone is critical. Okay. And so that has been really helpful. And then over time, I just even in the last year, I've been able to make a little space in my life to have some creative outlets and things that I really enjoy in addition to my world here at True to Life. But, I think overall my job has kind of ebbed and flowed. When I started, it was everything I loved. Then I went through a middle season where we were really going through some serious growing pains and weren't quite ready to add a whole lot of people to the team yet, where I was doing a lot of things that felt like really hard work, and I didn't have a lot of fun necessarily at that time. But now we've got a good team in place. We have a leadership team. I've got a great board of directors. And so now I'm kind of able to swing back into some of those sweet spots that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's very good that you also realized that it was a season. I know that I can see a lot of people going through it and just getting stuck and just, will this ever end? Any tips on how to kind of understand that you're just in a season, or kind of how to take a step back for someone who may be starting up a business and just losing their mind at the moment, going, I'm doing all this and it's killing me?
Yes.
Words of hope for someone like me? No, I'm kidding.
Jake, do you need some hope? Oh, yes. Let's talk about that. I think knowing that, our lives just work in seasons. They really do. And, the whole idea of going back to the good old days, or I'll get back to that sweet spot eventually, that doesn't happen. If we're going backwards, there's a problem. Even if we're trying to find something that we really enjoyed in the past, it's going to look different when we move forward toward that. So I think that for entrepreneurs, it's so important. We have the tendency to think of a million ideas and to want to implement them yesterday. I know I'm certainly guilty of that. Yeah, and I could drive the people in my life who are closest to me crazy because of that. But in order to carry out any one of those ideas, there's a messy middle. I think Michael Hyatt calls it that, the messy middle, where it's the actual work and minutia of putting the framework in place so that vision, that business, that organization can actually grow and carry out the work that it was intended to do. Yeah. So calling it a season, I think, is really important. I think having written goals is also really important because it gives you the why behind what you're doing. If you get lost in the messy middle, you can kind of feel disillusioned, you feel a little bit lost. But if your work is meaningful and that it's moving you towards something, that's really helpful. So having written goals are really important. And then connecting with other people who've been through it, who are further in the journey in their business or their organization than you are, can be so helpful because they can remind you that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
That's cool. Very good advice. So we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors, and then we're going to get back with Meredith King, and we're going to talk about what she's doing now because she's just not busy enough. And, so stick around. Hey, I wanted to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about Battle Cry Revival Marketing, the producer of this podcast. We believe that when businesses have quality marketing, it gives business owners the freedom to focus on what they do best. We design websites, produce videos, and create marketing materials to help our clients grow their business. Find out more at battlecryrevival.com. Now back to the show. Now back to the show. What I wanted to talk to you about now is, on top of running a nonprofit, being a wife, being a mother of 2 kiddos, you have also started writing a blog. Mm-hmm. You also do coaching. Mm-hmm. So clearly you have too much time on your hands.
If only that were true.
And so what kind of made you want to do a blog and start writing more?
You know, I think I realized over a sink full of dishes a while back that some of the life goals and dreams that I feel God placed in my heart weren't necessarily just going to occur. So I've wanted to write a book since I was a child. This is not a new goal or a new desire. And I was washing dishes one night and kind of talking to the Lord as I was doing that. And he just kind of reminded me books don't write themselves. And so I'm not going to wake up at a magic age and suddenly be a published author. And so at that moment, I had to decide, am I going to do the work? Just like True to Life didn't build itself. God has done miraculous work of provision and pulling people together. But there's been a lot of sweat equity by myself and so many other team members to carry out the work of materializing what is now True to Life Ministries and then carrying out our mission on a daily basis. Yeah. So I knew then I had some decisions to make. So a blog seemed like a really logical next step as far as a creative outlet was concerned. I kind of surveyed some friends of mine who were authors, some of which are New York Times bestselling authors, and they just said, Meredith, just start writing and you'll figure out what you enjoy writing about. You'll find your voice. You don't want to have someone else's voice. You really want to find your voice in the written word. And so that was one of the reasons why I started blogging, was to get some practice writing. But also, before we started recording, I was sharing with you, a lot of times people look at entrepreneurs, business owners, executive directors of nonprofits, or even pastors, any more kind of public figure, and they assume their life is really big, that they have 1 million friends and, have all of these social engagements and things. That's not true for me. My life is actually very small. So certainly I'm out in the public a lot. I'm in front of groups a lot. I attend a lot of events and things. But because I am a mom and a wife and the leader of an organization, my world is actually very small. So I don't do a lot of just for fun social activities and things like that. And I was kind of feeling like I needed a creative outlet. So that also was, a pro in the pro column for starting a blog. And so that's kind of how it all started. I also really love talking to people about faith and life and leadership, but I don't have a ton of time for those really intimate in-person conversations with the masses. So this is a great way for me to communicate with people kind of behind the scenes on the back end when they send questions or share their stories with me. I feel like that's a sacred space, and it's a tremendous joy.
Yeah. Well, that's before we started recording. all the good stuff. But
hopefully not all the good stuff.
Not all the good stuff. You mentioned kind of that where you enjoy the writing, but you enjoy working with and talking with people, and how those conversations kind of happen organically because of your writing. And I think that's one of the benefits that you have, or one of the great things about you, is that you use those opportunities. There's plenty of people that have a blog and they'll write something and just leave it alone and kind of let the comment section go nuts, and then there's people that engage. And I think the people that engage, like you, are really passionate about what you're doing. It's not just I don't know, it's not just a checkbox for you. And I think that carries over a little bit into the idea of coaching. And so again, you got a lot on your plate. Were people coming to you and asking you? I mean, how did that kind of...
The coaching consulting work?
Organically happen?
Yeah, so exactly. People kept asking, I'm an executive director, I'm in year one, I'm in the messy middle, or, I feel lost and disillusioned, I don't know what I'm doing, can you help? I started receiving a lot of inquiries to do staff development trainings for churches and nonprofits and parachurch ministries. And I've so benefited from people who have coached me and invested in my life from a really early age. Some of those people are still in my life, and some of them have been here for a season. But I think if we're breathing, we should be learning. And that's kind of twofold, like reaching forward to someone who's further in the journey from us to learn from them, and then reaching behind to somebody who's coming along behind. And so the inquiries were so many that I decided to start, saying yes to some of those. And so that's kind of how it started. And a little bit of it was maybe even a remnant from the consulting work that I did before we started True to Life. And so now, I'm able to do some work with that organization that I was with before we started True to Life. And then I do some things on my own to serve ministry leaders. And so as I look forward to the coming season, God has really stirred in my heart a passion to pour into ministry leaders and entrepreneurs who love the Lord and who want to be purposeful with their work to point people to Jesus, so that they can be successful and effective in reaching their communities or their countries, depending on the person.
And that's kind of what we try to do with the podcast, to encourage. And so that's why I'm really glad to be able to have you on. How do you balance all of that with being a mother? You are the first lady of this on the podcast, and I've asked all the guys that I've had on here, and we were talking, and the conversation is different when it's a woman entrepreneur. How do you balance the perceived notion of what motherhood is versus the reality of what motherhood is, on top of trying to start something that you're incredibly passionate about? No more passionate about it than you are about your family. But how do you balance that odd set of scales of, you're really trying to do something that impacts potentially lots of children, and then you have your own children? It's a very tight rope, I would imagine. It's
interesting. I think one thing that we had working for us that just made it a little less complicated is when True to Life started, and the work weeks were 80 hours, 100 hours. I mean, that was reality when we started. We didn't have children. So the girls weren't born yet. So my daughters are 6 and 2, and Abigail is finishing kindergarten. Ella is 2. We're, venturing into potty training. That's probably TMI, but I mean, it's real, keeping it real. And so when we first started, I didn't have children. David, was working with a small church in a very difficult area as far as ministry is concerned, lots of challenges there. And so it was pretty easy. I mean, we had a date night every Friday. We did what we had to do during the week. We could sleep in on Saturdays and stay in our pajamas all day if we wanted to. And so we had a great rhythm. When Abigail arrived on the scene, it totally turned our worlds upside down. And it took us about a year to kind of realize we were still happy with our lives, and we're glad that all of this was a challenge. Loved her, no question about that, but it sure was a shock to the system. So over the last 6 years of being a mom, I've done really great on some days and really horribly on other days. Recently, I've been contemplating the fact that this idea of calm, stress-free balance is an illusion. It's bogus. It's not real. And when you think logically, even about the word balance, and physically, from an exercise standpoint, how you build balance, you put yourself in really awkward, uncomfortable positions to strengthen your muscles. I don't do yoga, but I have friends that do, and they have incredible balance. But it's because for years they've done these challenging maneuvers with their body that are really hard to build those core muscles. And I think it's like that in our lives too. So if we're not living in tension, we may be pushing snooze on something really important. And so now that I've come to realize that, I have a lot less guilt that there's a little bit of a struggle there. But I've also really learned that there's only so much room on my plate. And once the capacity is taken, it's taken. So it's kind of like you have a few cards to play, but once you've played them, they're gone. A few yeses that you can spend. So just on a practical level, I have a capacity on the number of evenings I'll be out in a week. And regardless of what the evenings are for, whether it's something related to church or small group, or if it's a true to life obligation, once the evening quota is met, it's done. So everything after that is a no, because I want to say yes to being home for bedtimes. And I'm just not going to miss the majority of the week of bedtimes. I'm just not going to do it. Same for speaking. So speaking engagements, I love talking to people both about True to Life. I love speaking at conferences and retreats to women about how to grow in their faith and walk with Jesus and make disciples and all of that. But I'll only miss a small number of Sundays in a year being gone from our home church. My husband is on staff. He's a worship pastor. It's important to me to be connected to our local body. And so I've got a Sunday capacity. I'll only miss so many of them. And as far as out of town speaking engagements, I have a capacity for that. So that's kind of one of the ways that I'm currently balancing some of that. There are days I get home and I'm totally exhausted and I don't have the energy to play dress up or have a tea party. And sometimes I'm really good about powering through that, and sometimes I'm not. But I'm thankful for grace and a new day every morning.
Just let David do the tea parties.
Yeah. Hey, he loves them and he's really good at them.
Sorry, I'm picturing him doing a tea party. So as we kind of wrap up here, there's a few questions that I kind of ask everyone, and that would be, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
Mm-hmm. Oh, man. Ooh, that's a good question, Jake. Okay, so what gets me out of bed in the morning? I've really become aware that our lives are pretty finite. Scripture says we're a vapor in the wind, here one day, gone the next. I want to be a really good steward of the days that God has entrusted me with my family, with our community, with True to Life, with the people that I serve. And so I know that in order to do that, I've got to get out of bed. And to me, that's a joy. So just being connected to God's big picture, his agenda to pull the world to himself. I want to be a part of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any books that you recommend?
Oh, yes. In fact, I have several blog posts on my blog with recommended reading lists, so people can certainly reference that. So in the leadership and business space, Entree Leadership by Dave Ramsey is a go-to. It's required reading for every staff member who joins our team. Love that book. Have you read it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. So that's a must read. From Good to Great by Jim Collins. That's a great read. The 1 Minute Manager is excellent. I'm a big fan of that. And then I'm about to read The Advantage by Lencioni. And I've heard great things. I haven't read it yet, but I have a feeling it's going to land on my list. So those are some of my favorites in the leadership space. In the kind of on the other side of the coin, Love Does by Bob Goff is absolutely one of my favorites. And we're actually doing a big reading campaign soon, as we're inviting people to read that book with us. It also is required reading for staff members at True to Life. Love that one. Also really enjoy, actually it's sitting right here. So Bob's wife, Maria, wrote a book called Love Lives Here, and it's outstanding. Really, really like that one. And then there is a book called Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton that, it's one of those things, it makes you think really hard, and you may not land totally agreeing with everything that he recommends as far as working with people transitioning out of poverty, but it's really going to make you think, and I love that. So I definitely recommend that one.
Fantastic. Finally, how can people see more?
So meredithkingblog.com is my blog, and information there, a little window into my world. I do reply to comments.
For now.
Yeah, for now. And so that's a great way. All the speaking information is there as well. TTLM.org, as in True to Life Ministries, is a great way to stay up on what's going on here at True to Life. Of course, True to Life Ministries and then me personally are on Facebook. So that's a great way to connect. And I'm kind of really loving Instagram a little more than Facebook right now. So I'm at Meredith_A_King. So Meredith A. King.
Thanks for tuning in. Break the Box is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to help us out, a review would be greatly appreciated and is honestly the best way to help the podcast be heard by others. This podcast is produced by Battle Cry Revival Marketing and hosted by Jake Starkey. For show notes, visit battlecryrevival.com/podcast.